Welcome back to the AI Policy Podcast. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into the recent pushback on H20 exports and take a look at the EU AI Act Code of Practice. I'm Brielle, the Associate Director of the Wadhwani AI Center here at CSIS, joined today, as always, by my co-host, Gregory C. Allen.
Hey, good to be with you.
Nice to have you today. Greg, in the weeks since the U.S. government's approved Nvidia's H20 chip exports to China, the policy has triggered a wave of reaction in Washington and Beijing. Lawmakers, national security experts, and Chinese regulators have all weighed in, with some calling for renewed restrictions, others questioning the policy's rationale, and Chinese officials expressing concerns about the chip security. Before we dive into any timeline or what the debate looks like, can you just tell us what is an H20 and why are people talking about it?
Sure. Listeners of this podcast will be familiar with the AI chip export control debate, but to refresh your memory on this particular aspect, Biden administration originally launched these export controls in October 2020. At that time, the best chip you could go out and buy was an Nvidia A100, and the Nvidia H100, the successor chip, was coming on the market shortly. Now, because of these export controls, there has never been a legal opportunity to sell the H100 in China. It has always been illegal to sell H100s to China. But Nvidia, wanting to make chips that are available to be sold in the legal market, first sold a degraded version of the H100, which they marketed as the H800. And then after the Biden administration toughened export controls again in October 2023, Nvidia announced a new product called the H20, which was a further degraded chip that was designed to comply with export control restrictions, which are tied to the performance of the chip, both in its processing power and its interconnect speed. So basically how fast the chips can talk to each other. And how the Biden administration approached the performance metrics has changed over time. But the Biden administration, notably, while there was a faction in the Biden administration that was supportive of banning the H20 chip, and we'll talk about some of the characters in that story a little bit later, the Biden administration never actually did. So the Biden administration had a bunch of big export control muscle movements, really in its last 2 weeks in office. But banning the H20 chip was not one of those things, but it was something that, the China hawks and the tech hawks in the administration wanted to do. And it was something that there was a lot of support in Republican foreign policy and national security circles to do. And so this degraded chip, the H20, which by all accounts is still a pretty good chip. It's not good for everything that the H100 is good at. It's not good in all of the same ways that the B200 or the GB200, which is the Blackwell generation of chips that Nvidia now sells to American companies. But the basic point is it's still a really attractive chip in a lot of ways to customers in China because it's considerably better than the best chips that can be legally sold to China and the best chips that Chinese domestic companies, most notably Huawei and its primary manufacturing partner SMIC, are capable of making. And where the H20, really shines, and I think here, it's worth, relying on some external sources for this regard. It is not as good as the H100 at training. So this is the process of when you create an AI model, when you, scrape the entire internet and you have it analyze all of that data in order to create a thing called an AI model. But for running an AI model at inference, which is using it. So think about the difference between creating one of the models that powers ChatGPT, like GPT 4.5, and the process of running that model, serving it to the hundreds of millions of customers who access ChatGPT on a weekly basis. So that's the difference between training and inference. And because the H20, even though its processing power is comparatively low compared to the H100 or the B200 or the GB200, but its interconnect speed is very, very high. I mean, it's like an exceptionally good in terms of that. And because that is allowed under the export control regime, which had originally a dual technical performance threshold in order to be banned, and then later had a performance threshold that was mostly focused on either very high processing power or high processing power and high internet connect speed. The point is that this is allowed, and the point is that that is still a very attractive capability to Chinese model developers. And now we have to come back to one final thing. I realize I've been talking a long time already. Which is, the overriding premise of export controls under the Biden administration for AI chips was we are not going to sell them the most advanced AI chips because we want to hurt their AI industry, because we think that industry has very important national security implications, and we don't want China to have a strong AI industry, and we don't want Chinese or American AI chips to assist China in developing national security relevant capabilities. But at the same time, we want to minimize the incentive for Chinese companies to develop their alternatives to the American semiconductor ecosystem and the American AI chip ecosystem. So we're going to sell them older, lower performing chips, but we're not going to sell them the latest and greatest stuff. And that's trying to thread the needle of how much do you want to hurt the AI companies versus how much do you want to hurt the chip companies in China. And so while there was a very raging debate throughout the entire Biden administration, where they came down was ultimately allowing the H20, but it kind of looked like they might be in a position to ban it if the administration had gone on another year, hypothetically. And the Trump administration has now been on both sides of this debate. They banned the H20 on national security grounds, and then they unbanned it using that logic that I just stated, which is we're still not going to sell China H100s. We're still not going to sell China B200s or GB200s, but we think that selling them H20s is a degraded enough capability to thread the needle appropriately between hurting their AI companies and helping their semiconductor, and not wanting to help their semiconductor companies, especially Huawei.
Okay. So in essence, there's this H20 chip that's not necessarily new. It's created by Nvidia. It's been
they announced it in October 2023, and I forget when they first started selling them, but they were certainly available in 2024, and hundreds of thousands of these were sold to China.
And they're sort of twice degraded, not super, super high end, top of our line, but better than maybe some of the other chip developers in China can produce.
Yeah, way better. And that's for multiple reasons. One thing that I think is really important in this whole story is that the existing Huawei products are bad. And they would be bad even if they could make infinity of them. And that's true because the chips are unreliable, which is a pain in the butt if you have to build a data center where your chips are constantly failing.
Right.
It's because they optimized the chip incorrectly. A lot of the critical design work predates the large language model revolution. So they were targeting more the computer vision revolution and other stuff. And it's because Huawei's software ecosystem is terrible. And so it's hard to get these chips to do what you want. Even a chip much worse than the H20, as long as it has that Nvidia level of reliability, would still be competitive against Huawei. So I don't think the really strongest version of the argument for allowing H20 sales is, oh my gosh, the Huawei 910B. I've heard, about Chinese commercial data center customers who bought a lot of the Huawei 910B and then said, wow, nobody in our company is using these because these chips stink, and no way are we going to order the next generation of Huawei chip because Huawei has let us down. So
right.
The real threat is not Huawei's current generation of chip, because Huawei made a lot of mistakes and faces a lot of challenges. I think what the Trump administration is really thinking about is more about the next generation of Huawei chip, because even though Huawei made a lot of mistakes, they're not dumb. They won't, miss the target in terms of optimizing for LLMs next time. And so it's about, can we continue ensuring that Nvidia is the dominant AI chip ecosystem in China, for as many years as we possibly can.
Okay. So I want to dive later on into sort of the validity of some of these arguments and how that has played out and maybe what comes next. But I do want to take a step back for our audience to understand when we're talking about these policies. I think there's a desire to understand how we even got here in the first place. So let's walk it back. You said that this has been a debate in the Biden administration. It was banned by the Trump administration initially. They recently unbanned it, hence why we're talking about it today. But take us back a little bit and walk us through that timeline.
Yeah. So there's so much has happened. I mean, that's part of why I have a job, is because so much has happened and it's so incredibly complicated and interconnected that it constantly needs explaining, and why people might come to this podcast. But I think it's worth talking about a few things simultaneously. Number one is, Nvidia was not a $1 trillion company, right, in 2022. The ChatGPT revolution saw explosive demand for AI chips. And that happened to happen at the same time as the chip export controls. So what basically happened is that suddenly Nvidia is the hottest company in the world because they're the only company who can make the chips to power these large language models, which the entire world is going crazy over. Recall that ChatGPT is the fastest growing consumer technology product ever in history, according to adoption. It went from 0 users in October 2024 to 100 million users only a couple of months later. So that explosive growth, which was, something that all the other tech companies wanted to try and match by creating their own AI products, led to insane, incomparable growth in demand for Nvidia products. So at the same time that the Biden administration said, Nvidia, you're not allowed to sell your latest and greatest chips to China, there was almost no impact whatsoever to Nvidia's bottom line in terms of revenue. And that's because there was such a shortage of Nvidia chips around the world. And that shortage kind of continues to this day, with some caveats. I'll clarify that. But that's really important. So then connecting it to, the H20 chip, that's when Nvidia was designing it in late 2023. And in mid 2024, you had the CEO of China's DeepSeek. This was in July 2024. The CEO of DeepSeek gave an important data point in saying, are these export controls having a strategic impact? So in his interview, he said, we do not have financing plans in the short term. Money has never been a problem for us. Bans on shipments of advanced chips are the problem. So the Chinese AI ecosystem is feeling the pain of these export controls, because, for a while they were able to buy a lot of those H800s,
right?
But not every company, stockpiled an equivalent amount of those chips, and the folks who couldn't get enough of them had real pain. Now, DeepSeek stated that they trained their advanced AI model, which was a huge media sensation in January of this year. They said they trained them on those H800 chips. So my point here is that export controls always have a lagging impact. The Nvidia chips, are sold for a year or 2 years on the market. And just because you ban the sale of something doesn't mean everything you've already sold magically disappears. And so DeepSeek is kind of reflects the lagging impact of those export controls. And at the same time that, DeepSeek is experiencing a shortage because of the export controls, this is mid 2024, the rest of the world is still experiencing a shortage just because of rampant demand for the product. So it was in September of 2024 that, Oracle, he's no longer the CEO, but he's the founder, Larry Ellison of Oracle, was talking about a dinner that he had between Elon Musk himself and Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang, where he said, quote, I would describe the dinner as Oracle, me and Elon, begging Jensen for GPUs, saying, quote, please take our money. Please take our money. By the way, I've got dinner. No, take more of it. We need you to take more of our money, please. Right. So that's what demand looked like in the middle of 2024, like customers trying to outbid each other to get a spot in NVIDIA's opportunity. So in the same month that NVIDIA formally launches the H20 chip, which is October 2024, they launched the H20 chip, but they also announced that Blackwell GPUs, which is the next generation of chip, you can't even, they're not even on the market yet in October 2024, says that they are sold out through the end of 2025. So literally, by October of last year, we are still fulfilling orders that NVIDIA got then for Blackwell chips because they've been sold out for so long. This shortage has been so incredibly pervasive. And this is a key point for the advocates of the chip export controls, right? NVIDIA is saying, oh my gosh, we lose a lot of money when you ban these chip sales to China. But at least in the short term, that has not been true. Because there has always been, 10 other customers who are happy to buy every single chip that NVIDIA can produce. And that was certainly true through all of 2023, all of 2024.
So am I understanding this correctly, that when we're talking about the AI and chip ecosystem, certainly in early 2024, all the progress that had been made in AI advancements had been on existing chips that were already in the ecosystem. So we're not even talking about these super high advanced, like pre-sale order chips that you just mentioned.
Right. So like GPT 4.5. I don't know that any Blackwell chips were used to train that. It's possible that they were, but it's certainly plausible that they were trained almost entirely on H100s because, that had been on the market much longer. You could, we were still fulfilling those orders for that. But now the Blackwell is, the primary chip that NVIDIA is trying to market, the primary generation of chip that NVIDIA is trying to market around the world.
So when we're talking about export controls at that point moving forward, it was sort of an aim of developments 2-3 years down the road because of the back order of chips.
Yeah, like as I said, right, there's like a lagging impact to all of these export controls. Meanwhile, China, as soon as the H20, goes on the market, again, October 2024, huge demand from Chinese companies for this. There was $16 billion worth of H20 orders. And from NVIDIA's perspective, even though there are probably other customers who would be willing to buy that chip manufacturing capacity to build H100s or to build Blackwells or what have you, they still want to sell to China. And that is not so much a this year revenue story, because as I said, there's the shortage. But that is what do the next 5 years look like? Do we have a future in China? Is there, is NVIDIA still the dominant chip ecosystem for AI in China 5 years from now? And if they, don't have anything to sell their customers, you can understand why those customers might say, we have to go find an alternative chip ecosystem because we can't get NVIDIA stuff. So it's not like this year's revenue is why NVIDIA cares about selling to China. They care about making sure that over many years, when this shortage eventually goes away, they still have a vibrant, massive customer base in China. That's kind of what they're thinking about. That's what they're prioritizing.
This is a really important point to underscore, especially when we get into the current debate about what should or should not be done about the H20s, what should not be done about export controls moving forward, because we're talking about the future here. You can't just take the current ecosystem that we have and base decisions off of that alone. You have to look into what does the global market look like moving forward and how are companies thinking about that. So sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to underscore that point. So now H20s are on the market.
Yes. Okay. So now we fast forward to April of 2025, and there China imposes export controls on the United States of rare earth minerals and other kind of critical minerals for magnets. And this is pretty scary for the United States because while the dollar value of rare earth imports is not like shockingly huge, they're a key input into almost all modern electronics. And modern electronics are a key input into almost all manufactured goods, whether that's cars, whether that's phones, whether that's fighter jets. These are really important things. And a lot of industries are pretty terrified of these Chinese rare earth imports. Now, this is something that the Biden administration, they believe that they had sort of navigated the escalation of export controls brilliantly in such a way that, China never felt a need to pull this trigger. Yeah. I think most of the analysis basically says that the reason why China imposed these rare earth export controls was tied to the tariffs that the Trump administration imposed upon China. However, after China imposed their export controls, the United States imposed a bunch of export controls in addition to what they had already done. And one of those things was the H20 export controls, which in early April 2025, the Trump administration sent Nvidia a letter notifying them that they would require licenses to export the H20 chip. Whereas previously, because of its performance specification, it did not always require a license. And when you say requires a license, it's sort of like, well, are you requiring a license and you're going to approve my license? You don't always know. But in this case, it was like, no, we're not going to approve your license. We're requiring a license. And when you apply for one, you'll be rejected. And at the same time this is going on, April 2025, the shortage of GPUs continues. So Sam Altman in April 11th, 2025, he says at the TED conference, quote, "All day long, I call people and beg them to give us their GPUs. We are so incredibly constrained." And it's not just American companies that are facing this shortage. In May 2025, Wang Qi, the vice president at Tencent's cloud computing unit, Tencent, for those who are not aware, is one of the largest digital tech companies in all of China. They're responsible for WeChat, the Chinese social media giant, among, having a large cloud computing business and other, tech businesses as well. And he said in May 2025, quote, "The most severe problem is the limited resources of graphics cards and computing resources." Graphics cards means graphical processing units, GPUs. And he said that the tightened trade controls, so Wang Qi is talking about the H20 specifically, right? He's talking about the tightened export controls that the Trump administration has imposed will, quote, "widen the gap regarding AI adoption between China and the US in the short term." So here you have a Chinese technology executive saying the H20 ban is going to extend America's margin of leadership in AI. Now, he's focused on the short term. As we said, the long term is a little bit more complicated of a story. Now, okay, as I said, a lot of stuff has happened on this. June 11th, 2025, President Trump announces a deal with China that he claims will allow the United States to resume purchases of rare earth exports. July 7th, 2025, a report by Wedbush Securities. So this is an equity research firm. They do research, on like stock prices for like Nvidia, among other things. They find that the B200, which is the Nvidia Blackwell chip, remains in short supply. And then July 14th, 2025, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick announces approval to resume H20 exports to China. So now here's where we get to something where there's kind of a debate. Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, he told CNBC that this was part of the deal to get the rare earth and critical mineral export controls eliminated. The Chinese side of the story appears to not share that conclusion. So the Chinese Ministry of Commerce issued a press release on July 18th, 2025, stating that, quote, "We noticed that the U.S. side recently, again on its own initiative, expressed that it will approve the sale to China of Nvidia H20 chips." And hat tip to Rush Doshi for providing the rough translation there of the Chinese government press release. But that, I think, is kind of interesting, right? So previously, the Trump administration had said that the export controls that they had imposed that had sort of brought China to the negotiating table when it comes to rare earths were on stuff like ethane, which is a critical input to manufacturing all plastics. This is a petroleum and natural gas. It's really actually a type of natural gas. And that the ban of natural gas exports to China affects their plastics industry, which affects all kinds of manufacturing stuff. And then also jet engines related export controls. So you have the export controls that are clearly part of the trade war and are acknowledged to be part of the trade war on the US side, which is like ethane and jet engine stuff. And then you have this other thing, which is H20s, which at least officially in the beginning was not part of the trade war. And the Trump administration says, oh, that we got rid of that as part of them getting rid of the magnets deal. But there's other statements from Trump administration officials where they say like, oh, we're not budging on the chip export controls. They ask about that in every meeting. We're not budging on that thing. And so the other thing that happened here is that Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang visited Donald Trump in the White House. And it's shortly after that period in which the H20 export controls are lifted. So the question here, the unresolved question is, did the Trump administration eliminate these export controls as part of the magnets deal, as Commerce Secretary Lutnick has said, or did they eliminate them, what you might call unilaterally, because they had reached the conclusion that these export controls were not in America's national security interest, which is what they now claim, right? They say that it's ultimately better, and this is what Lutnick is saying, it's better that China remains, quote, addicted to the U.S. technology, meaning the H20 and the Nvidia chip ecosystem, and it's better that America, get the revenue from all these sales to China. So that's kind of the story, and I realize there's an awful lot there. It's one final quote, as I said, right? There's different stuff coming out of the Trump administration. Not all of it agrees with it. So on July 29th, 2025, this comes from Greer, who is the U.S. trade representative, if memory serves me correctly. Quote, "We had no agreements with relations to U.S. export controls." So he said that on July 29th, following 2 days of meetings with Chinese officials in Stockholm, Sweden. So that seems to lend credence to the point, right, that the lifting of the export controls on H20s was not tied to some broader agreement between the United States and China related to magnets or anything else.
So you brought up the argument that one of the reasons the Trump administration decided to unban the sales is because it's actually better for U.S. national security if Chinese manufacturers are addicted to Chinese technology or American technology. Is that the only argument that supports this decision to unban the H20s, or what is that ecosystem sort of saying in support of this move?
I think that's the only national security argument to support the unbanning of the H20, right? For those who make it, they're essentially saying that you have to weigh, what is the 1 to 2 year risk of China catching up in AI because they have the access to these chips versus the 5 to 10 year risk of China catching up in semiconductors as a whole, and then us never even being able to wield this export control weapon again in the future because we will have given Huawei, access to the entire Chinese market and voluntarily left the Chinese market, so they are fully independent from U.S. technology. So that's the national security case for resuming these exports as made by the Trump administration and Nvidia.
Okay, so then who's on the other side of this debate? Why might this be considered a mistake in some circles?
Oh, I'm sorry. You know what? There actually is one other argument. I was talking about, what's going on in China, but it's worth pointing out here that White House AI czar, David Sachs, he told Bloomberg, quote, "We are not selling the latest and greatest chips to China, but we can deprive Huawei of having this giant market share in China that they can then use to scale up and compete globally." So what he's basically saying there is that it's not just, Huawei is going to outcompete Nvidia in China. It's that once they outcompete Nvidia in China, if we export control ourselves out of the market, they will then go and compete with us everywhere. Now, the flip side of that is, stuff that Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang has said in the past, which is our chips are so good and the total cost of ownership of our chips is so good that even if our competitors' products were free, they would be too expensive in comparison to our product. And Donald Trump said something recently in his July 23rd speech announcing the AI action plan. He said that he was of the opinion that even if he had, launched an antitrust investigation of Nvidia and broken them up, it would still take 10 years for anybody to catch up to Nvidia because they're that good. And so the question is just how strong is Nvidia's competitive dominance? And, how much do we need to be worried about Huawei? As I said, Huawei's short-term, situation is extremely bad. But, long-term, they've got a massive, amount of research and development spending every year. They've got a huge base of smart people, and they're all working really hard on this problem. So that's kind of the geopolitical and national security stakes as advocated for it by the Trump administration that made this move.
Okay, so then on the other side, who's opposing it? What are they saying?
Yeah, and this is where we've had a lot of developments just in the past couple of weeks. And I would say the opposition is kind of an interesting group of folks. So you have Republicans on the leadership of the House Select Committee on the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. You have Senate Democrats, notably Elizabeth Warren, who has been incredibly outspoken against this. You have previous Biden staff, previous Trump staff from the first administration, and even some from this administration who have left the administration and are now advocating in favor of the H20 ban, and independent experts. So there's quite a lot of pushback on this move to allow H20 exports. And I think it's worth starting with the opposing letter from Representative Molinar, who is in Congress on the Select Committee. He's the chair of the House Select Committee, and he wrote, quote, "Nvidia can produce these chips at a scale that their Chinese competitors cannot rival, making it unlikely that restricting H20 exports to China would simply shift demand to Chinese alternatives." In a June congressional hearing, Undersecretary Kessler estimated that Huawei can make about 200,000 advanced chips in 2025. In contrast, U.S. AI companies are expected to deploy over 14 million AI chips in 2025. So what he's basically saying is look, the administration is telling us that if we don't sell these chips, that Huawei is going to take over the Chinese market. And his point is Huawei can't make chips to take over the Chinese market. I made the point that their chips are lousy, but there's this additional point, which is that they can't make very many of them, at least not right now. They actually can make more than 200,000, according to my analysis of the story. But the key thing to keep in mind here is that they only have one active 7-nanometer semiconductor manufacturing line. And that same semiconductor manufacturing line has to make all the chips that they need for phones, all the chips that they need for laptops, all the chips that they need for telecom equipment, all the chips that they need for AI chips and data center chips. So if they just gave up on phones, if they just gave up on laptops, yeah, they could make more than 200,000 chips. But they're not going to do that because their phones are good and their AI chips stink. And so they're probably going to delay, scaling up this production further until they have a better design and more familiarity with the 7-nanometer node process so they can bring their chip yields up. Okay, so separate from, Molinar, his letter, there's a group of Senate Democrats, and they addressed it also to the Commerce Secretary Lutnick. They said, quote, restricting access to leading edge chips has been the defining barrier for China's efforts to achieve AI parity. And I think that's accurate. If you think about where we might be in the absence of these export controls, if hypothetically, the Biden administration had never taken us on this adventure of AI chip export controls, well, the largest publicly disclosed, chip facility in the world, there might be a bigger one now, I don't know. But in January of this year, XAI was talking about having 200,000 H100s in their Memphis facility. If there were no chip export controls, I promise you there would be at least one 200,000 chip facility in China, maybe more than that. There's enough money in China. There's enough talent in China. The tech companies are big enough. They have enough demand if they wanted to serve it. And so the point here is, if these export controls had never happened, China might already be ahead of the United States in AI. And it's not just, people like Senate Democrats who are saying that these chip export controls have worked. It is Chinese tech giants like Tencent, like DeepSeek, who are saying that these export controls work. And I think what's really shocking to me here is that, you're seeing people change sides in this debate in a way that's kind of interesting, right? The Trump administration starts off incredibly hawkish and enacting these regulations, and then they shift and they say they want a more relaxed posture. Well, even The Economist, which almost, this is the British publication, which for the entire Biden administration was saying, oh my gosh, what are you doing with all these tech exports, against China? Your tech trade war makes no sense, blah, blah, blah. That's like what they wrote the entire Biden administration. Well, on July 31st, they wrote an op-ed called "America is Easing Chip Export Controls at Exactly the Wrong Time." So The Economist, which unlike other kinds of newspapers, does have a official, position. They will take a stance on given issues. And they said that actually these export controls are great and that loosening them doesn't make any sense. I think the really one that kind of stood out for me was a group of 20 national security experts and former government officials who signed a letter to Secretary Letnick calling for the H-20 ban to be reimposed. And that included folks like Matt Pottinger, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor in the first Trump administration. It included David Feith, who was the lead for technology and national security on the Trump National Security Council in the second administration, until he was removed, along with a lot of the Mike Waltz staff during that, exodus of officials. And so there is a lot of pushback on this story. It's kind of unclear how the debate overall is going to shake out. We just hosted Michael Kratsios, the director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. He pointed, to the fact that he's seen signs that the shortage of chip production is abating, and that Nvidia now is able to, more meet demand. And so that makes, if true, right, that makes it less costly. It makes it more costly to have these types of export controls. And Nvidia did, in its financial disclosures, talk about a $4.5 billion write-off. That's all the product that they had that was going to be an H20 chip, that was various stages through the manufacturing process, all that they had invested in bringing the H20 up to be manufacturable. The CEO of Nvidia has said that some of that is lost forever, right? It's like half-made chips that were genuinely scrapped. Other parts of that investment, now that the exports are being allowed to be resumed, might be allowed. But overall, it's kind of just a remarkable time in overall. And what's so interesting is, you see in the American AI Action Plan, there's all this language about how they're going to be tougher on export controls. There's stuff that I've been calling for, like bringing the intelligence community into export control enforcement more, like bringing a greater focus on components in semiconductor manufacturing equipment, like making sure that we enforce export controls more effectively and go after smugglers more effectively. So there's still this kind of I don't necessarily want to say mixed messages, but it's not obvious to me that every single action of the Trump administration here is kind of rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, I have one last question for you on this. We need to move on to some of our other points on this podcast, but shameless plug to listen to our last episode of the AI Policy Podcast to hear all about that AI action plan, our event with Michael Kratsios. And you can also check out the video online. It'll be in our show notes, yada, yada. One last question for you, Greg. Where do you come down on this debate? And then what should we watch for in the future?
Yeah, I think one thing that I wish more people knew was true in this story and had the historical context, because what I'm about to say even predates the timeline that I gave in this story. And it goes back to some of the export controls that were taken in the first Trump administration, right? Like export controls of advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment, export controls of chip sales to ZTE and Huawei in 2018 and 2019 and 2020. Well, those muscle movements all persuaded China that they already had to be off American technology. That was already, an overriding policy priority. Now, you have Made in China 2025, which starts in 2015, which talks about getting rid of foreign technology dependence, both in chips and chip manufacturing equipment. That's an industrial policy priority. The Chinese government is spending literally hundreds of billions of dollars against that goal. And that gets supercharged after the ZTE and Huawei export controls. And what I think so many people forget is that Huawei would be a much more significant threat to Nvidia today if we hadn't had export controls in 2020. What I'm getting here is that Nvidia has been propped up by export controls in a way that is not broadly understood for the past 5 years. So here I'm just going to read from my report that I published earlier this year on DeepSeek, Huawei, and the future of export controls, because this is something that I think is really worth understanding. Huawei has been a player in the AI chip market for longer than is generally realized. Huawei had a 7-nanometer AI accelerator chip planned for production at TSMC in 2020. At the time, Huawei was preparing to capitalize on the so-called 352 policy, in which the Chinese Communist Party's central office ordered all government agencies and many state-owned enterprises to eliminate the use of all non-Chinese technology within 3 years. However, Huawei was unable to fulfill demand because of the Trump administration's updated 2020 entity listing, which temporarily cut Huawei's Ascend and Kirin lines off from TSMC. In this instance, Nvidia was the beneficiary of these early U.S. export controls, which delivered a setback to Chinese efforts to eliminate dependence on the U.S. AI chip technology. So what I'm pointing out here is we already have a demonstrated policy preference from the Xi Jinping regime, which is Nvidia, this is 2020, Nvidia is allowed to sell everything. They're allowed to sell everything to China. And what is the Chinese policy directive? No government organization and no state-owned enterprises are allowed to use Nvidia chips. You have 3 years to get clean of your addiction to American technology. And the only reason why that didn't come true is that we cut off exports of ASML, advanced manufacturing equipment. We cut off exports of a bunch of other types of advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And we cut off access to TSMC of Taiwan as a contract chip manufacturer for Huawei. In an alternative universe where we hadn't done that, think about where Huawei would be today in 2025, right? Every Chinese ministry would be rocking Huawei. Every state-owned enterprise would be rocking Huawei. And I bet a decent amount of the private sector would be contemplating Huawei adoption as well. It is the export controls that protected Nvidia from Chinese purchase mandates. And so at the same time, right, that like Nvidia is saying, oh my gosh, export controls are so bad for our business. Like Chinese policy is so bad for your business. And export controls are one of the absolute critical tools that we have to push back against Chinese policy. And the same, I think, is true, not just for Nvidia in the chip sector, but for all aspects of the technology ecosystem. And so, as the AI companies are saying, look, we need you to not allow American companies to help China race faster in the AI race, which the Trump AI action plan said is like equivalent in significance or greater in significance to the space race of the Cold War. It was not legal to sell computers to the Soviet space program during the Cold War. It was not legal to help them with their rocket technology. If we are in a race, I think we have to ask ourselves, like, very carefully, under what circumstances do we want to allow to provide help? And it is very, very crystal clear that all the best Chinese AI companies say buying H20s would help.
Well, you described it earlier as an adventure. The adventure is going to continue. I guarantee this is a recurring topic on our podcast. We'll go ahead and drop the Huawei and DeepSeek report in the show notes as well, in case anybody didn't catch that when it came out. But I want to move over to the EU now. So on August 2nd, the European Commission's AI office released a list of companies that have signed the EU AI Code of Practice. Most leading AI firms, including OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, and Microsoft, have signed on. Meta notably did not. So walk us back through, what is this EU AI Code of Practice? I know we've talked about it in this podcast, but for anybody who's just tuning in, what is this? What's the EU AI Act? Give us a download.
So the EU AI Act is the flagship European policy for AI regulation. It created the EU AI Office, which has a dual mandate of regulation and promoting innovation. This policy, the AI Act, has a bunch of different downstream implementation vehicles. What we're talking about today with the Code of Practice deals specifically with general purpose AI models, which really focuses on large language models, the type of stuff that ChatGPT is, or Anthropic's Claude, or Google's Gemini is. So these are the models that can do a lot of different stuff, right? OpenAI, ChatGPT wants to be your therapist, but it also wants to be your lawyer, and it also wants to be your coding engineer, right? These are general purpose models that can do an awful lot of stuff. And the AI Act basically said, hey, the way that we need to regulate these general purpose models is going to have to be different than the way that we regulate these single purpose models. And in some ways, it's much, much easier to regulate these single purpose models, right? Like we kind of know how to regulate autonomous vehicles because we know how to regulate cars, but regulating this one AI that wants to be your therapist, lawyer, and engineer is a little bit trickier of a situation. So the EU AI Act basically says that there's going to be this thing called a code of practice. So mostly the AI Act says, like, thou shalt follow the standard, and we're going to come out with the standard. And here now, finally, in its final form, is the standard, which is the code of practice. Yes. And what's interesting is it is a tool for demonstrating compliance. So there are requirements that are in the AI Act around transparency, around adherence to copyright law, around safety and security for these general purpose AI models. So they have requirements that they have to meet. Now, the guidance for, like, you have to be transparent, you have to be safe, you have to be secure, you have to adhere to copyright law, that's very high level in the law, right? It is like it's more detailed than what I just said, but not by a ton. So if you're a company and you're like, okay, I can be, fined like percentage points of my annual revenue if I don't abide by this law, the language in the law is kind of vague. How do I know? And how do I win if I have to go to trial, right, and like argue in front of a judge? How do I know and show that I'm adhering to the law? And the answer to that is the code of practice, which offers the sort of nitty-gritty detail of what you need to do to demonstrate compliance with the law. Now, what's interesting is that, industry was sort of invited in the process of drafting this. They were given multiple opportunities for input. So will civil society. They created these, committees of experts to draft it. They had iterative drafts in which they put out a draft code of practice, got feedback, put out a draft code of practice, got feedback, etc. And that whole process has now landed where we are. But what's interesting is the law doesn't say thou shalt follow the code of practice. The law says that you must either follow the code of practice, which will be taken as a presumption of conformity and compliance, or you must come up with an alternative mechanism that is in compliance with the law. And that alternative mechanism has to be kind of negotiated with the AI office. So when these companies say they are signing on to the code of practice, what they are saying is, we think that the code of practice is the most straightforward means for us to demonstrate compliance with the law. It minimizes our overall legal risk, et cetera, et cetera. When Meta, which notably did not sign on to the code of practice, they're not saying we are going to break the law, right? What they're saying is, we think that the code of practice is more extreme than the law requires. We don't like the various nitty-gritty ways through which the code of practice has gone about seeking to implement the law, and we are going to fight to come up with an alternative compliance mechanism, and we will hash that out in negotiations with the EU AI office. But it's not, nobody is saying that they're going to exit the EU market. Nobody is saying that they're going to violate the law. It's right now, it's sort of the debate between the companies that say the code of practice is how we're going to comply with the law, and other companies that say we're going to try and find a different way to comply with the law.
Right. We've talked about on this podcast before how it does serve as that presumption of conformity, that there may be some other work streams that sort of complement this. My assumption, though, is that any other ways that you could demonstrate obeying the law would kind of mirror some of the language in this code of practice, or at least that's my untrained thought about it. I think there's 3 sections in this code.
You said something interesting there. I kind of agree with you. My honest question here is, because I said it's going to be a negotiation between Meta and the AI office. And imagine if hypothetically, every company had said, we're not going to do the code of practice. We're going to demand, an independent means of negotiation. That would probably be a bad day for the EU AI office, right? Like they would be, they would have to defend, to their constituents and to the media and everything else that what they had done was good, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's worth, pointing out Meta is negotiating right now, right? When they say we don't like the code of practice, that is already the first, salvo in the negotiation about what compliance is going to look like for them. And all of this is happening in the backdrop of negotiations. The tariff deal has already been struck between the US and the EU, at least at a high level. President Trump and Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, have already announced that. But what does it mean for EU companies to regulate American tech companies that operate in their market? Is a very open question. And we just saw at the APEC conference, the Asia Pacific Economic Conference, Director Kratsios of White House OSTP, he was urging Asian countries to not follow the European Union's approach to AI regulation. And so that is also part of the negotiation about what is the rest of the world going to do in this story.
Okay. So there are 3 sections to this code of practice. What do they say? What does that look like?
Yeah. So there are 3 sections, transparency, copyright, and safety and security. And they are quite complicated. What we're going to do is we're going to go through them at a high level. The easiest one to understand is the transparency one. This is documenting and providing technical information about models. And specifically, these are these general purpose AI models, and I have the form that you're required to fill out. This is the model documentation form. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, you're looking at it right now. But It's 3 pages. It's got a lot of check boxes, and it's like the legal name for the model provider, the name of the model, the release date. I mean, this is very familiar stuff for any model card. If you've ever been a part of the AI world and you're familiar with the term model card, which was like kind of standard documentation that originally Google popularized, this is model card type information. You know, there it says like include your acceptable use policy, include your licensing process policy, include the types of data that you use to train it, the data curation methodologies, but you know, it says like recommended 200 words, recommended 400 words. So it's not like they're expecting you to go into like incredible nitty gritty detail about all the technical documentation of the model. This is pretty high level guidance that basically just gives the EU the basic vital statistics, you might say, of all of the large models, all of the general purpose models that are going to be operating in their market. You know, there's some stuff that, you know, folks might get a little bit frustrated with, like the amount of energy used for training. Maybe some companies wouldn't want that to be public. But overall, the transparency part of the code of practice is not, I would argue, where the meat is. I would argue the meat is really on the copyright side of the equation and on the safety and security side of the equation. So on copyright, the AI Act just says, quote, put in place a policy to comply with union law on copyright and related rights. So that's what the AI Act says. What does the code of practice says? It says that everybody who abides by the code of practice must, quote, draw up, keep up to date, and implement a copyright policy. Reproduce and extract only lawfully accessible copyright protected content. So there's some stuff that's like banned here. If you think about, for example, Anthropic, which disclosed in the course of recent legal proceedings that at an earlier date, they had accessed a pirated database of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of books, and included that as raw training data. Well, all those books were pirated and stolen, and that violated the copyright. And so like that is, you know, banned here. I think Anthropic didn't argue that it was legal in the United States either. I think they sort of admitted that they were, violating copyright in that instance. They ultimately changed their practice to buying hardcover books at market price and then chopping off the binding and mass scanning the books so that they could say they, copyrighted with copyright. Now, identify and comply with rights reservations when crawling the World Wide Web. This, I think, is the big one in terms of actually maybe shaping the behavior of AI companies. So, if any provider online is like displaying copyrighted content, they can then put a metadata tag on that website, usually goes in the robots.txt file that says like, you are not allowed to scrape this information for training AI models. Now, I don't know how much of an impact that's going to be, right? If you think about like, think about Disney animation, right? Like that artistic style. If you go to Disney.com, you will presumably encounter hey, AI, you're not allowed to train off this data. But then think about if you go to Reddit, you can find a lot of screenshots of, still images from Disney movies. All that stuff's going to be on Reddit. And I assume like Reddit is not going to say like, hey, you can't scrape our stuff, it's copyrighted. So how all of that's going to work in practice, how effective it's going to be, I don't really know. But then two final requirements that I think are interesting. Designate a point of contact and enable the lodging of complaints. So this is like when somebody says, hey, you're violating my copyright, it has to be like an email address or a phone number that people can get in touch with at the companies for that. That's going to be probably a lot of emails to go through. And then mitigate the risk of copyright infringing outputs. So in addition to, making sure that they only access copyright inputs for training legally, they have to also, take effective measures to make sure that they're not, reproducing in the outputs in the chat windows, copyright infringing content. So that is actually genuinely controversial. Not everybody signed up to that. XAI signed partially. They signed the chapter of the Code of Practice on safety and security. They did not sign the copyright one. Meta did not sign the copyright one. Meta didn't sign any of them. So that's interesting. But obviously the other companies, Google, Anthropic, etc., they did sign it. So that's that. Okay. Finally, on safety and security. This one is so much longer than the other ones. It's like 50 plus pages. The transparency one is only like 5 or 6 pages. And there is a ton in here. And I think we're actually going to have a future podcast episode where we bring in somebody from the drafting committee on the safety and security one. So I'm not going to go into as much depth here as perhaps I would like, but stay tuned. On this podcast, we should have somebody in a very strong position to talk about that. But the big thing here is like you have to evaluate your models. You have to have standardized protocols for evaluating your models. They have to reflect the state of the art, and you have to have some kind of detailed safety and security framework, and it has to allocate responsibility for mitigating systemic risk within a company. So I don't know if that story ends and like you have a chief safety officer and you have to give the chief safety officer like the approval to, overrule anybody but the CEO and say this model can't go out because I'm, the safety officer and I say so. I don't know what that looks like, but the basic point here is they're not telling you what your safety and security framework has to be. They're just saying you have to have one. And it needs to, actually have a credible story for how it's going to make the people of Europe, more safe when it comes to AI. And, that I think is noteworthy. There's a lot more I could say, but it's perhaps best if I stop there because I've been rambling for a long time.
Well, I want to get into a little bit of the why behind signing these. So, as you mentioned, Microsoft, Anthropic, OpenAI, Google all signed onto the Code of Practice. Meta did not. I wasn't aware that you could only sign part of the Code of Practice, but apparently XAI also only signed part of it. What are they saying about why? Because it can't be that they don't want to sell or operate in the EU market. I assume that the goal is to then go through a different presumption, go beyond this presumption of conformity. So have they mentioned why they did not sign on to these specific?
Yeah. So Meta's chief global affairs officer had a post on LinkedIn that said, quote, which I think this just says it all. Europe is headed down the wrong path on AI. We have carefully reviewed the European Commission's Code of Practice for general purpose AI models, and Meta won't be signing it. This code introduces a number of legal uncertainties for model developers, as well as measures which go far beyond the scope of the AI Act. So they're basically saying, bad job. We don't like this. What's interesting is that even the other companies that did sign mostly also said, bad job, Europe. So like Google, for instance, in their statement on it, they said, we remain concerned that the AI Act and the code risk slowing Europe's development and deployment of AI, in particular, departures from EU copyright law, steps that slow approvals or requirements that expose trade secrets could chill European model development and deployment, harming Europe's competitiveness. Microsoft said that Europe should refine and improve the AI Act and the Code of Practice. So nobody's really saying like, awesome job. We're really grateful and glad that you did this and we can't wait to be a part of it. They're kind of signaling that they're going along with this grudgingly. And I think there's like, honest questions here. Like number one is, if they had come out and said, we love this, great job, Europe, I suspect the Trump administration would get mad at them, right? The Trump administration is trying to fight supposedly on these companies' behalf to get the EU regulatory burden lightened. So there's that kind of part of the story. I think there's also like the sincere part of the story about how these companies in general are skeptical of pre-hoc, regulation. Basically, like regulation is the how AI is created as opposed to what AI does, right? If the AI designs a bioweapon and that hurts a lot of people, they can understand why that was against the law and why they had to go to jail or pay fines, right? But like a law that says, you must perform this checklist of 500 actions to make sure that your system never does produce a bioweapon, that they tend to be opposed to, right? Like that sort of preemptive style regulation. Not that they don't want to have safeguards, but they just don't like the regulatory aspect of it in most cases. So that's kind of where we are in this negotiation. I think the EU is going to charge ahead. They're going to have to figure out how to implement this code of practice, which, while we have a lot more detail than we had 6 months ago, there's still a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah, and my one last unanswered question is, what about enforcement? What does the timeline look like for that now?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You might think like, it applies immediately. But what's interesting is the AI Act on general purpose AI models started to apply on August 2nd. So we're already in the enforcement era, but only for models released after that date. So for like GPT-4o or GPT 4.5 or, Grok 3, those were all released before it. Before the August 2nd deadline. And so companies have to make their best efforts for old models to comply by August 2027. So enforcement, and that's for compliance. Enforcement or fines will only start in August 2026. And for GPAI, it's different than for some of the other parts of the EU AI Act. You've probably read, if you're reading about the EU AI Act, that the fines can be up to 7% of global turnover. Turnover is pretty similar to revenue. It's not quite the same thing in business accounting. But that's for other parts of the AI Act. For the GPAI stuff, it's only 3% of global turnover, and that can kick in August 26th. So companies right now are, of course, trying to come up with their safety frameworks and try and think about how that's going to comply with the code of practice and how they're going to get all their ducks in a row for this new era of EU AI regulation.
Well, we'll certainly be following all those ongoing negotiations. Be on the lookout for more information about that upcoming event where we are going to dive, if you can believe it, even deeper into this topic. That's a wrap on today's episode. We'll catch you next time. Thank you so much, Greg.